India's fuel exports are once again making global headlines. And this time the numbers are historic. The scale is massive. And the implications are profound, not just for India, but for the entire world energy market. When we talk about India's rise on the global stage, we usually mention IT, we mention services, we mention defense, and we mention space technology. But what is often underestimated, yet equally powerful, is India's strength in energy refining and fuel exports. Today, India is not just consuming energy. It is producing refined products at such a scale that it has become a lifeline for markets across Asia, Europe, and beyond. This surge in fuel exports is not an isolated event. It is deeply connected with geopolitics, global sanctions, Russia's refinery damage, America's tariff pressures, and the shifting trade routes of the 21st century. And in the next few minutes, let me walk you through how India has positioned itself at the heart of this energy transformation, why the world is relying on India, and what risks and opportunities lie ahead for this extraordinary momentum. To begin with, India is the world's third largest energy consumer. But when it comes to refining capacity, it is among the global leaders, rivaling even developed economies. The Jamnagar refinery complex in Gujarat, owned by Reliance Industries, is the single largest oil refining hub in the world. India's refining sector is so advanced that it imports crude oil from diverse sources: Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, the United States, and then refines it into high-value products like diesel, petrol, aviation, turbine fuel, and then exports it to over 150 countries. This unique position allows India to play both sides, a major importer of raw crude, but an equally major exporter of finished fuels. In recent months, this dual strategy has paid off in an extraordinary way. As global markets were disrupted by Russia's war in Ukraine, by sanctions on Russian oil, and by attacks on Russian refineries, a gap appeared in supply chains. Europe suddenly found itself desperate for alternative sources of diesel. Asia was running short of gasoline. The Middle East was stretched thin with production commitments. And stepping into that void quietly but decisively was India. Reports show that India's fuel exports have surged to multi-year highs, with diesel shipments to Europe alone hitting record levels. Indian refiners, particularly Reliance Industries and Nayara Energy, which has links to Russia's Rosneft, have increased runs at their refineries to produce more output. This is not just about profits, although the profit margins are high when crude prices are cheap and refined product prices are elevated. It's also about global relevance. When Europe needs fuel, when Asia needs gasoline, when developing countries are struggling with energy shortages, India becomes the reliable supplier. The scale of this surge has been remarkable: millions of tons of diesel shipped westward, tankers lining up at Indian ports, and record volumes of petrol and jet fuel heading out. India is now not just feeding its domestic market, but also balancing global supply chains. Now, why is this happening? The answer lies partly in Russia. Over the past months, Russian refineries have come under severe stress, some from sanctions, others from Ukrainian drone strikes, and others from technical breakdowns due to lack of Western spare parts. This has cut Russian output of diesel and gasoline significantly. Countries like Brazil, Turkey, and even some in the Middle East that relied on Russian refined fuels had to look for alternative suppliers. At the same time, Europe, which once bought large amounts of Russian diesel, was left scrambling for stable imports. This is where India entered, filling the gap, exporting more diesel westward and increasing gasoline shipments to regions like Africa and Asia. In effect, India's refiners became the shock absorbers of the global fuel market, stepping in when others fell out. But this is not just a story of opportunism. It's also a story of deliberate planning. For years, India has invested heavily in refining capacity, building not just large facilities, but state-of-the-art ones capable of processing a wide variety of crudes. While some countries can only refine lighter crudes, India can process heavier ones, which makes it an ideal buyer of discounted Russian oil. India buys Russian crude at a lower price, refines it, and then sells the finished product at global prices. the margins are significant. For example, if India buys Urals crude at a discount of $20 to $30 per barrel, refines it, and then exports diesel to Europe at premium rates, the net revenue is huge. Arbitrage has given Indian refiners an edge that few in the world can match right now. Now, let's look at the geopolitical angle. Washington has been increasingly vocal about India's deepening oil ties with Russia. The United States, under President Trump, reimposed high tariffs on Indian exports like steel, textiles, and jewelry, and has warned New Delhi that reliance on Russian energy might complicate trade talks. But here's the catch. While America pressures India, Europe quietly welcomes Indian fuels, even though much of it comes from Russian crude. It's a paradox on one hand. The West sanctions Russia. On the other, it depends on India to supply fuels refined from Russian oil. This contradiction is the very heart of today's geopolitics, and India has learned how to navigate it with skill. Let me also add that India's surge in fuel exports is not only about geopolitics, but also about economic strategy. Exporting fuels strengthens India's balance of payments, brings in foreign exchange, and boosts domestic industries. The more fuel India exports, the more its refiners earn, the more jobs are created, and the more the rupee stabilizes against the dollar. At a time when global markets are volatile, having such a strong export sector is an invaluable buffer for India's economy. And let's not forget the domestic impact, because when refiners earn more abroad, the government collects more in taxes and duties, which in turn funds infrastructure and welfare schemes. But every opportunity comes with risks. The first risk is overdependence on Russian crude. If Washington or Brussels tighten sanctions further, or if insurance companies and shipping firms face penalties, India's cheap access to Russian oil might be restricted. That would increase input costs and reduce export margins. The second risk is tariffs. With Trump back in power in the United States, there is talk of punitive tariffs on Indian refined products, especially if Washington feels that India is indirectly profiting from Russian energy. The third risk is volatility in global oil prices. If crude prices spike sharply, refining margins may shrink, and exports could fall. So while India's current surge is impressive, sustaining it will require deft diplomacy, careful economic balancing, and strategic hedging. Another important angle is competition. China, too, has large refining capacity, and if Beijing decides to increase exports aggressively, India could face competition in key markets. Similarly, Middle Eastern producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are expanding downstream industries, aiming to export not just crude but refined fuels. India must therefore remain competitive, maintaining efficiency and ensuring logistical advantages like shorter delivery routes to Europe and Asia. At the same time, India's focus on renewable energy and green transitions must not be neglected. Because while fossil fuel exports are booming now, the long-term future of energy is in solar, wind, hydrogen, and nuclear. Balancing the short-term windfall of fuel exports with the long-term shift to clean energy is the challenge policymakers face. Yet, despite these risks, one thing is clear. India has emerged as an energy power in its own right. No longer is it just a passive consumer vulnerable to the whims of OPEC or global markets. Today, India is a supplier, a trader, a player that can shift the balance in fuel markets. From African countries that now buy Indian gasoline, to European nations dependent on Indian diesel, to Asian airlines that rely on Indian jet fuel, New Delhi's reach is visible everywhere. And this reach translates into geopolitical leverage. When India talks to Europe, it knows Europe needs its fuel. When India negotiates with Washington, it knows American companies want access to India's growing market. This leverage is subtle, but it is powerful. To conclude, India's surge in fuel exports to multi-year highs is not just a number, not just a headline, but a signal of deeper change. It tells us that India's refining capacity is world-class, that its diplomacy is agile, and that its economic strategy is bearing fruit. It tells us that in a world of sanctions, wars, and supply disruptions, India can play the role of stabilizer, provider, and opportunist all at once. But it also warns us that this position will be tested by tariffs, by sanctions, by price swings, and by competition. For viewers like you, the takeaway is clear. Watch this space closely. Because the story of India's fuel exports is not just about diesel and gasoline, it's about India's rise as a global power, shaping markets, influencing geopolitics, and rewriting the rules of 21st century trade. And as we move forward, keep this in mind. When the world's tankers sail from Indian ports, they don't just carry fuel, they carry with them a symbol of India's ambition, resilience, and growing influence. The surge we are seeing today may very well be the foundation of India's economic power in the decades to come. The numbers are high, the stakes are higher, and the journey is only beginning.